The Region Free Gamers welcome you to the Battle of 1998. On this match, it's Xenogears versus Gran Turismo.
Welcome one and all to the Region Free Gamers podcast, the podcast that is fluent in gaming. My name is Arnie, and my lovely voice will be hosting this episode for you today. And today we're doing something special. Weird, but special. This is the inaugural episode of the Region Free Gamers 1998 Summer Invitational, which is what I've chosen to call this. I'm hoping that I can make this title even longer and more convoluted as we go on, but we'll see. We're workshopping it right now. I'm also hoping that at some point I can convince Ozzy to buy a trophy that we'll present to whoever ends up winning this whole thing. But just a quick note before we get started, because this is going to be a little bit shorter than our normal long-form episodes. Please rate and review us on iTunes, y'all. We know you're listening, and we love you. We just want to know that you love us as well. And so with that out of the way, I want to introduce my two lovely co-hosts who will be working with me on this before we sort of explain what's going on. So, first off, my longtime co-host and all-around game connoisseur, Ozzy. How you doing, Ozzy?
Hey, man. So I'm just picturing myself, like, sitting outside of the Polyphony offices, you know, with a trophy for Yasunori Yamauchi saying, "Hey, Gran Turismo, you won the Summer Invitational,
did it,
blah,
guys.
blah, 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 blah."
I'm picturing
and
you...
Yasunori Yamauchi just called security.
I'm picturing you more in sort of like a Crash Bandicoot role, like with a giant megaphone yelling at them to come out and get their trophy.
Yeah, I don't think the Japanese look kindly upon that.
And besides Ozzy, we do also have a special guest today, and she has been very kind to be quiet for this long, even though she didn't really have to be. She's, you know, the only person on this panel that I am convinced will actually make sound and reasoned arguments, just based on our history of debate. But making her triumphant return after blessing us with her presence on our Persona 4 episode, it's Kelly, aka Sierra Night Gaming. How are you doing, Kelly?
Oh, I am doing well. Nice early morning today, so glad to be back. Very happy
Kelly,
to be
we
back
are
on
counting
here.
on you. We are counting on you because based on our prior history, me and Arnie have very hot takes, and last time we almost came to blows.
Oh boy!
Never mind that we're on Skype and we can't really, hit each other, but the feeling was there.
The mental was there.
We're not actually recording an episode. We just brought you in to like mediate our therapy session.
Oh boy!
If that's okay with you.
Oh boy! Now I feel like I can't take
showing.
sides. I have to be like, totally neutral on the whole
thing. So let me just really quick give people a rundown, because I'm sure upon clicking on this episode, most people's first reaction is, "What the hell is this?" The conceit of this whole thing is basically we had always wanted to do an episode talking about our favorite years in gaming. It's something that Paul had brought up almost at the beginning of the podcast, but we quickly realized that talking about a topic like that would be insane, because there's so many games to talk about and there's just not enough time in a single episode to do all that. So as a sort of compromise, we decided, it'd be fun. Let's make sort of a tournament style where we just put 16 of the best games of a given year into a bracket. This will give us an excuse to talk about it and have cool people on to talk about it and maybe have some laughs along the way. So that's what we did. I basically took 16 of the best games from 1998. I threw them in a randomizer and they spit out a bracket, and this is what we got.
I like to think that you were watching March Madness when you came up with this.
It's probably probably more accurate than you realize.
We're probably just gonna call this like August Madness or something, or Summer Madness if you want to go with the Cool and the Gang theme.
I know. Well, see, that's the thing is, what I'm gonna say right now is there is a structure to these episodes. There is criteria that we wrote up for each individual matchup and how we're going to be looking at this game. Things like, critical reception, sales numbers, genre defining, like legacy, all that sort of abstract stuff that makes something like this happen. But at the end of the day, I think it's really all about fun. It's really about us just sort of discussing what we like about these games, what we don't like about them, how they sort of affected us when they came out during this time. And, it's going to be sort of a personal decision for each person at the end of the episode to vote on which game they'd like to see move forward. Best 2 out of 3
for yourself,
wins.
man. I mean, I'm completely scientific here, so I'm approaching this, with scientist gloves. I'm gonna go in as objectively as possible so I can demolish these games.
See, I am doing the complete opposite. I am just going to go off which one has the cooler box art.
Well then, I've got to say some of these matchups are really you can tell they're random because wow.
You know what? Let's just get into it. I feel like that's just the best way to approach this. So our first matchup is Xenogears versus Gran Turismo. And
you were bearing the lead here, Arnie. Xenogears and Gran Turismo. Those are our inaugural matchup. I still don't know what to think. Whether this is just a lopsided seed or not. It might be. But I guess we'll see.
Well, here's my thing, is when I did the randomizer, and this was essentially the first matchup it spit out, and I was just like, oh my god, this is going to be a disaster. Because, I feel like, regardless of what we did, there were going to be matchups like this, where it's just like two completely different games that just, on the face of it, seem to not be comparable at all. But the more I dug into the research and the more I learned about these two games, I do actually think that there's a good matchup here. I think that these two games have sort of a lot more background stuff in common than we'd like to think. But
I'm very much looking forward to that argument.
Well, I know you'll be surprised by what I have to say.
I think I know where you're going with it. So,
I know.
Yeah.
Well, here's the thing. So, the year is 1998, guys. This is a big year. This is the year of Baby Bottle Pops. Furby came out in 98. The Game Boy camera came out in 98. Like, a lot of things are happening. And in the midst of all that, we have what I would say is arguably the greatest year for video games, like, in terms of what came out that year. And so, you have, on one hand, you have Xenogears, which is an RPG published by Squaresoft at the height of their powers. Would you not agree with that?
I would agree with that, yes.
Like, this is Square on the heels of Final Fantasy VII, like, completely destroying, sort of the idea of what a 3D RPG was going to be and sort of making their mark felt. And then you have Gran Turismo, which, on the face of it is like, oh, racing simulation game, but also the highest selling game on the PlayStation ever, and Sony's most successful franchise of all time.
Even with what you've just said, I think that you're shortchanging Gran Turismo. When you say car racing simulation
I think
game,
that's
you have
what
to
people
realize
think, like, on the
they
face of it
weren't
when they see
actually
this.
any car racing simulation games on consoles.
That's true.
If there were on PC, I don't know them. But you basically are just burying the lead there. Like, this was the game that built the car simulation genre.
They created a genre in and of
So
themselves.
don't just say, oh, a car racing simulation game and just, not even nod at it.
See, this is why I'm excited about this. Because I know you have some stuff to say about Gran Turismo. I know Kelly has some stuff to say about Xenogears. So I think this is going to be a nice back and forth debate, and I might be the clincher on this one. I want to do.
Let me just mention that if you want to get more of our thoughts about this period of Squaresoft, I still call it Squaresoft because I like to remember the golden years. You can go back to one of our early episodes in which we just go through, Squaresoft around that PS1 era.
We did.
Which is one of our most fondly remembered eras because it was just such an experimental period for them. They were just coming out with, for lack of a better term, weird shit.
Yeah.
And I loved them for it. If you had the 16-bit era with Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy VI, etc., those were just very well-crafted, progressive evolutions of the RPG genre.
Yeah.
With the PS1 era, Squaresoft was just throwing shit at the wall to see what stuck. And it was
a lot
awesome.
of it stuck.
A lot of it
Very
stuck.
well,
A lot of it landed. Xenogears, it's arguable.
Well,
I think the jury's still out on whether Xenogears, stuck the landing.
Yeah. And I think the best place to start for comparison's sake, at least for me, like the easiest way to do this is sort of a tail of the tape. Just comparing them, and then we'll sort of get into our thoughts on each. But Xenogears released October 20th of 1998, developed by Squaresoft. Importantly, sort of the brainchild of Tetsuya Takahashi, who had cut his teeth on a lot of Square 16-bit RPGs, including Final Fantasy VI, and I believe he also worked on Secret of Mana. Sales-wise, Xenogears was a successful game for Square, shipped 1.3 million units worldwide as far as I can tell, and it's the first installment, in air quotes, in the Xeno franchise. I say air quotes because it's not really a connected franchise. It's sort of like Xenogears is here, and then spiritual successor Xenosaga, and then Xenoblade Chronicles, which is apparently connected, but also sort of a restart. As far as critically, the game was lauded. Holds a Metascore of 84, which makes it the 25th highest rated video game of 1998 according to Metacritic. I like Metacritic because it sort of aggregates reviews from all over the place.
Yeah, but let me add a caveat there, Arnie,
Yeah.
before you go any further. I know that we have Metacritic, and Metacritic is one of a catch-all that we now use as gospel. But the reality is that Metacritic only aggregates a lot of the online sources.
Yes,
and
that is correct.
I can tell you, maybe it's just my personal experience, but I know for a fact that back in the day, there were some magazines that really critiqued Xenogears hard.
Yeah.
They just thought it was outdated, or they thought that it was too complicated. It was just not fun to play. I mean, chief among them, GamePro. I don't put a lot of faith in GamePro, but they gave it a pretty bad review.
Yeah.
So, and Famitsu, of all people, who Famitsu pretty much rates everything in the, in perfect range.
Yeah.
They gave it a 31 out of 40, which is very telling. So I don't think that it's quite as critically lauded as Metacritic would have you believe.
Yeah.
I think that reception was a little bit more divided, and some people thought it was the next coming of RPGs. Other people thought, Square got in too deep into its knees, and now, they don't know what the hell they're doing.
Yeah, I think you're right. It was a divisive game when it came out. I just use Metacritic as sort of a standard to compare it to the other game it's going up against. But you're right. It wasn't universally praised.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is that, at the time in 98, you still didn't have a lot of online presence of, review sites actually putting up, their reviews for games online. It was mostly magazines at the time. So you'd really have to go back, to really see it. I mean, EGM, aggregated it to a 35.5, which is good. It's, I guess it's close, it's between a 7 and 8 range. So that's, not perfect, but, it's pretty good. It's actually 8 to 9, most likely, if we really are going to look at it that way.
Yeah.
So that's not bad. IGN gave it a 9.5, which is pretty high.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I think that it did receive a good review. I don't think it's one that sold well, at least initially. It eventually kind of gained a cult following, and people started talking about it as this game that you had to play. From what I see here, there were 280,000 copies sold outside of Japan.
Yep.
A lot of the copies that were sold, a lot of the units were actually from within Japan.
Oh yeah, and you'll see that a lot with some other games like this.
Yeah, some of these RPGs, because for lack of a better term, Xenogears is anime as hell.
Yeah.
And I think that we can all agree on that. And everyone at the time was riding the Neon Genesis Evangelion train. So anything that had robots and vaguely religious, philosophical, psychological allusions would sell like hotcakes in Japan. So it's no surprise that it didn't do that well here. And it wasn't only, I remember for a time, Xenogears was actually a more rare game than we think of it now. And it was only later that Squaresoft released a greatest hits version and re-released the title. So that was, I think, probably in late 2000, early 2001, so some years later afterwards. So at least initially, it didn't sell that well. And, not that sales are any metric, but, we're taking it into account with respect to this. So,
oh, absolutely.
It's just something we should consider.
Yeah, I take sales probably a little too seriously, honestly.
Way too seriously. Particularly considering that your Sega Genesis Mini would have been a sales disaster.
Yes. But then on the other side, we have Gran Turismo, released May of 98. developed by Polyphony Digital and Cyberhead. It also has sort of a creative auteur in Kazunori Yamauchi. Gran Turismo, like we already said, highest selling game on PS1, so 10.85 million units, which is insane to me to even think of those sort of numbers.
It's still insane.
Yeah.
It's still insane. You have to realize that most games today don't hit that. That's what a Call of Duty hits, whenever it releases. And even some of them haven't hit that.
Yeah.
It's insane because in 98, 99, there weren't that many consoles in homes.
Yeah.
It just wasn't as prevalent as we have it nowadays. Everybody now has a console and everybody's playing it.
Well, and you got to think also, this is a console exclusive. This isn't, something that's being released on multiple consoles. This is just PS1.
Yeah, nowadays you aggregate PC, Xbox, PS4, everything, and that gets you to a higher number. I mean, we look at something like Grand Theft Auto 5 selling 25 million units or something like that. That's insane.
Yeah.
But that's kind of a stratospheric, difference. That's on a league of its own. But, Gran Turismo, I mean, even within, the metrics of today, it's still freaking impressive.
Yeah. And so when I looked at these two, I'll just tell you guys where I was at. And I want to get your opinions on where you were at initially. Because I know, Kelly, we pitched you this sort of blind. And I don't know what your reaction was to seeing these two games as something you'd have to talk about. But mine was sort of like...
Kelly, you're here to defend Xenogears.
Yeah, believe me. I know.
Well, mine was sort of like, damn, I guess I'm going to go Xenogears on this one because... that was just my sort of like snap decision. And then when I started reading about it, this is where I'm at now, is I'm not really comparing these two games as games. I see them more as the expressions of these two auteur directors who really wanted to do some like crazily ambitious things. And then on the one hand, you have Xenogears, which is sort of that expression being truncated by the limits of your development time and your resources. And on the other hand, I see Gran Turismo as like that expression when you're given as much time and money as you can.
And that much time is 5 years.
Yeah,
it took 5
exactly.
years to build this thing.
Exactly.
And when you say auteur, it's also underselling Kazunori Yamauchi.
Yeah.
I mean, this guy probably sweats engine oil. He's, passionate about cars. It's almost like a fetish for him. I mean, to the point that he's even driven in the 24 hours of Le Mans. He's a professional race car driver. He eventually turned himself into a race car driver. And, the 5 years, it shouldn't be understating, the amount of work that went into it. I mean, apparently, according to Yamauchi, they were sleeping on their desks most of the time.
Yeah.
They were just, they would never go home. They would wake up, go to work, they would go to sleep under the desk, and they would keep on working as soon as they got like 4 hours of sleep.
Yeah.
It was brutal. And to be honest, I mean, I've seen, the tales of later Gran Turismo games and Polyphony, and it was very much like that, at least, for Gran Turismo 4 and even Gran Turismo 5, it was still very much like that. Like, Polyphony is known as a freaking, grindhouse.
Yeah.
Like, it just, you go there and you dedicate your life to Polyphony, basically.
Yeah. And so one thing I wanted to ask you, Kelly, because we've been talking a whole lot, but I do want to get your opinion on this because I believe that did you play Xenogears when it came out? Like, in 98, were you sort of experiencing this game?
I demoed it a little in 98.
Okay.
I ended up purchasing a copy off of eBay, I want to say in 2000, and got it home and instantly played it beginning to end, because it was when I was really into Evangelion, anime, and everything else, so it was just the perfect game to play at the time.
Gotcha. What was your sort of, because I know you didn't play it in 98, but you played it contemporaneously enough that I trust your take on this. What did you think of it as it compares to maybe other RPGs you had played up to that point? Like, was Xenogears, like, did you enjoy your experience with Xenogears the first time you played it, or was it something that you sort of had to let digest a little bit?
So the first few hours of it, when I first demoed it, it seemed kind of just out there. I mean, but at the same time, well, it seemed like there was a lot going on underneath. On the surface, it was just a robots, fighting game type of deal.
Okay.
But once I got past the desert portion where you meet a couple of the characters out there, you just start seeing that underbelly of there's a lot more going on.
Okay.
And that first disc was just a ride. I couldn't believe how long it was. I couldn't believe how many stories were just interwound into it. It was just masterfully done in the storytelling sense.
Yeah.
And then you got to the second disc, and it was just a disappointment at that point. Yeah. I mean, the exploration was taken away from you. It was basically almost a visual novel type, where you were just getting all the story through a visual novel, and you only got to play certain scenes of the game. So my time that I remember really is with that first disc, and just the scope of the world and how it just built that world and all the characters, and you would just get more and more characters and all the religious imagery and everything else. It was just amazing for the time, because I just remember the days up until that point, until I got a PS1, it was all Nintendo, and it was just all the censorship you got there. So just seeing it branch out and get all this religious imagery in there and all this controversial things that were being said, I loved the game. I've been trying to go back and play it now just to re-experience that game, because it's been so long. I want to remember all that time I had with it.
Yeah, and that's really the crux of it. And I wasn't aware of this really when I went into this, is that it seems like the first disc in Xenogears sort of sets up this gigantic world with these, beautiful visuals, engaging characters, things that people really love. And then when you get to the second disc, expecting more of that, you're sort of in this space where I think that's where the fan base sort of goes one way or the other. Either they really enjoyed it, beginning to end, and don't have any problems with how it's told, or they're like, the first disc was great, the second disc sort of dampened the experience a little bit, because, like you said, it sort of takes control away from the player, essentially, only letting you play certain battles, and then the rest of it is told through, cutscenes and sort of text conversations with characters. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. You basically have a character sitting under a light, just with text scrolling by,
telling you.
So
the
in
story.
a way, I mean, the parallels to Evangelion are, in more than one way. You have these two works that are overly ambitious, that lead up to this massive biblical, scenario, and then at the end, you're just kind of like given like a visual novel, and kind of a lot of blabbering exposition.
Yeah. And you have to do a lot of research to figure out exactly what was going on.
And here's the thing is, when you sort of look at it, you start to realize what's going on here. Based on what I've found out, apparently this was Takahashi's pitch for Final Fantasy VII, and that was rejected.
Oh, no, shit.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
It later went on to, apparently, subsequently, it started development as a Chrono Trigger sequel, but then it, they sort of scrapped that idea, and then they just let him do his own thing and gave him his own team.
Arnie, let's just put a pin on that, because let's imagine that this had actually been Final Fantasy VII, and that should tell you, at least with respect to what we're doing now, putting, games head to head and the influence they had, I have a hard time believing that if Xenogears had been Final Fantasy VII, that RPGs would have blown up the way they did.
Well, here's the thing.
I have a hard time thinking that.
At the same time, Xenogears, because of when it was in development at the same time as Final Fantasy VII, so all the resources that could have gone towards Xenogears instead were in Final Fantasy VII, and he was just given a shoestring budget to work with.
Yep. And here's the thing.
But
and most of the animators that it was working with, most of the people it was working with were brand new. They didn't know how to do 3D at all. So it was just, he had to teach them everything and get this game shipped in 2 years.
Initially they wanted to make it like Final Fantasy VII, where it was completely 3D, but the people who were working with them didn't have that sort of experience, which is why they sort of ended up doing the 3D environments.
Wait, but Final Fantasy VII is not. I mean, it's 3D,
sorry,
but it's pre-rendered.
Yes, but they wanted to make 3D.
This
sprites.
one is actually 3D. This one is actually 3D. Like, it actually has 3D modeled worlds.
The worlds are 3D modeled, if I'm not mistaken. Actually, no,
they're all 3D modeled.
They're pre-rendered.
You have character sprites, though.
Yeah, you have character sprites. That's the only thing that's 2D. But, I mean, when you put it against it, I mean, the reality is that Final Fantasy VII was the type of game for its time. You know, with Aerith, there wasn't an Aerith in Xenogears. With the story of one man, rediscovering himself and finding the will to love other people and get close to people and saving the world against Shinra and Sephiroth and all those things. None of that is clearly identifiable in Xenogears. There's no, like, the overarching big bad that is Sephiroth. It doesn't have any of the elements. Even if you had put the best, developers on the case, I don't think it would have left a mark. That, for lack of a better term, Final Fantasy VII was pretty mainstream, and it was easy to access and digest. Xenogears, there's no way that, your common 12-year-old would have been able to digest it. I'm telling you this because I played Xenogears as a 10-year-old, and I was just left wondering what the hell. So it's hard to think about that, and that the Xenogears would have had the same impact as Final Fantasy VII if it had been Final Fantasy VII.
Here's the thing. I'm not disagreeing with you because I think that you're right in that had Xenogears been the pitch for Final Fantasy VII, it would definitely not have been the same game. Here's an interesting thing I took away from this, though. The reason they allegedly turned down this pitch for Final Fantasy VII is because it was too dark. And yet, if you look at what Final Fantasy VII is and its story, that's a pretty dark storyline, And when you look at the elements, the aesthetic elements of Xenogears that sort of focus on mecha and robots and sort of that synthetic vibe that you get from it, like you said, it's very anime as hell, right? You sort of see a little bit of that in Final Fantasy VII, like Midgar, Barrett's mechanical arm, like that. Those things. Final Fantasy VII is much less medieval than the earlier Final Fantasies. It's much more
cyberpunk.
Steampunk.
Final Fantasy VII is cyberpunk.
Yeah. And I think I'm not saying that came directly from this pitch for Final Fantasy VII. I think it's completely possible that was sort of something that developed on its own. But I think that you could see maybe they sort of cherry-picked some things they did like about this pitch and eventually transposed them into what Final Fantasy VII.
Arnie, that's a stretch, man. Come on. I mean, Final Fantasy VI had, robots, and it had... Final Fantasy has always been about the merging of sci-fi and fantasy. Mm-hmm. So this was not a thing that Xenogears pitched. I completely think that you're completely wrong there. So I'm sorry to go against that, but Final Fantasy VII is just an evolution of Final Fantasy VI. And it has its own identity, and you're stretching when you think that because Xenogears has mechs, that it influenced in some way, the cyberpunk setting of Final Fantasy VII.
I think
it's a completely different mold.
That this was a big guy in Final Fantasy. He had done work on, big Final Fantasies before. I don't think that, I'm not saying that Xenogears has any influence on Final Fantasy VII, but I think if you're Takahashi and you're sort of pitching these things, I think people at Square listen to some things that you say. I think you've done your work. I think there's a reason they gave him his team. So I don't think it's insane to think that there was some sort of melding of the minds there a little bit.
Yeah, but we're getting off track, Arnie. Let's get back to talking about the influence. Talking about I guess this goes into genre defining. I mean, was the game genre defining? And no,
you don't think so?
In many ways, no. Xenogears has always stood as this kind of niche. Outlier. Even its battle system did not really have any influence whatsoever. The kind of almost fighting game mechanic thing where you punch in, combos, and that's how you perform your battles. It didn't really have any lasting effect on any other games, and for a long time, Xenogears was just a niche, game, and even today, it's just a cult game, but one that I don't think, beyond Takahashi himself kind of following up the Xenomold with the Xeno Saga games and the Xenoblade games, I don't really think that it has had any kind of bleeding into other RPGs. It's kind of, an evolutionary dead end that never really went anywhere beyond its own self-contained universe. And I happen to think that even if they redid Xenogears today, they probably wouldn't use, a lot of what was there. They would probably try to do something new. Okay. So no, I don't think in any way it was genre defining. I mean, even its themes of religion, its Jungian archetypes, etc., Jungian archetypes, etc. That's something that, first of all, it's very Evangelion, so a lot of it is just derivative of Evangelion, and to the extent that it's derivative, you could say that whatever came after that had elements of that probably came from Evangelion rather than Xenogears itself. But even then, I don't see a lot of other RPGs other than, I don't know, perhaps Shadow Hearts, that did that. Yeah. So I think that it just kind of stands on an island of its own. Not saying that it's bad. Yeah. But it just kind of stands on its own.
Yeah. I want to get your take on this too, Kelly, because I think here's my opinion, is that I do agree with you on this point. I don't think that Xenogears has had, in terms of direct influence on other games, I fail to see, sort of that through line. And I think part of that is Xenogears sort of came out in a time when RPGs were blowing up. And I think that it sort of got lost in the shuffle. If you look at what was coming out and what had come out and what was coming out, Final Fantasy VII, Grandia, Wild Arms, Lunar, like the list goes on and on. So I think that Xenogears in this particular matchup suffers from the fact that there was just so many big, great RPGs coming out at the time that it's sort of hard for it to stand out amongst the crowd. Does that make sense, Kelly? Or
well, I mean, PS1 is one of the best for those RPGs. There's just so many great RPGs. And it was honestly the first time where they actually started coming out in North America and in English. Yeah. So, yeah, I can see it getting lost in the shuffle. For me personally, it's still one of those games. It's honestly, if Square was to say tomorrow, you know what, we're going to drop Final Fantasy VII and remaking that, and we're going to do Xenogears instead, I would probably be one of 3 people on the planet that would be like, yes, this is a good idea.
And Kelly, let me mention that I would love that. I think Xenogears really deserves a mulligan. And it really deserves, its creator kind of being given the opportunity to make it the way that he wanted it, without budget constraints. But then again, in the world of Squaresoft, and we have seen with Tetsuya Nomura, it's not always great when you give someone unlimited resources to realize their vision. Absolutely. Because most of the time, they don't really know what their vision is.
Yeah. But this is, and I will say, here's something in Xenogears and in Gran Turismo that I think sort of highlights this, is that Takahashi, from what I can tell and what I've seen and read, seemed to also be overly ambitious in not a great way, in that he kind of didn't know how to manage his team and manage the sort of process that goes into it, and continued adding and adding and adding, even
let me say, I mean, Yamauchi did the same.
Yeah, but Yamauchi, I think, maybe knew that he had a little bit of leeway, and he had that time and that budget, whereas
no, I don't think so. I think he was just a dictator. I think he was just a dictator. I think he just made everyone, say goodbye to their families and not see them again for 5 years. Yeah. I think he probably had them at gunpoint, most likely.
But Xenogears was supposed to be a 4-disc game.
Xenogears was supposed to be a 6-episode game too, with Xenogears itself being episode 5.
Exactly.
Yeah. So no, but I think, Arnie, I mean, because I think, I'm the only guy here that really, is kind of talking about Gran Turismo.
You're right.
And we're steering very much into Xenogears territory, and this is not a Xenogears episode.
You're right.
But if we're talking about genre defining, I mean, yes, it created the genre. Yeah. So Gran Turismo created the genre. And really, it was a clear demarcation point from the arcade racing that came before it. Before this, you had things like F-Zero, Top Gear, a lot of games that Outrun that were just based on the thrill of speed. Just have fun. Whereas this, was about the slavish devotion to simulating and recreating the feel of driving a car, whether it be a Civic or a Nissan GT or a Chevrolet Corvette. Whatever it is, it was about giving you the perfect feel for racing. And let me say, for someone that still doesn't have a driver's license, someone that's a kid. No, I do have a driver's license.
Oh, God.
No. I'm saying hypothetically. Let's say that you're 12, 13 years old. This was, something that gave you that degree of freedom of like, I'm actually learning how to drive.
Yep.
I'm actually doing something worthwhile with my time. I'm not just spending my time playing video games. I'm actually learning the rules of driving. And I have to think, this game really had a lasting effect on the psyches of millions. Millions of people that right now their love for video games, for cars, it's all, can be all traced to Gran Turismo.
Yeah.
Let's say someone like me who was in Cuba and we didn't get new cars, we didn't really know what cars were out there. This was exactly the type of game that I needed because it gave me this window into the world of cars that I did not know existed. And it was an almost encyclopedic, not almost, it was an encyclopedic database of cars, at least released up to that time, up to 1997, because, of course, 1998 was a little bit difficult to incorporate the year release. But it really was a way for you to dive into the world of cars. And from that point forward, it's clear that now we have race car drivers that say that what got them into racing in the first place was Gran Turismo.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about genre defining, that really is the genre that it defined. And, let's not take away the fact that it had an impact beyond games. Drivers used to, play it to learn the tracks. The Nissan Skyline, which was a previously unknown car here in the United States, it was unimported, was, begged to be released in the United States by people that had played Gran Turismo. Another one was the Mitsubishi Lancer Evo. That's another car that only released in Japan. And then, eventually Mitsubishi released it in the United States because it was so popular in Gran Turismo. And so car manufacturers realized that this was a huge marketing opportunity. And so they wanted their cars in the game. And even to this day, even in the world of Forzas, etc., Gran Turismo still holds a mystique and a sway that car manufacturers really drool over. Because it's kind of seen as the real, enthusiast's game. And, if you want to make some comparison, it almost was like an RPG.
That's what I was going to say. I was actually going to tell you about this. This is one thing I really do like about Gran Turismo is the fact that, first of all, I find it really impressive that you take something as specific as what this is. On the face of it, it's a racing game that should theoretically only appeal to car enthusiasts because the degree of detail and the degree of work that went into giving each of these cars those unique physics, designing them to race like their real life counterparts is crazy. But then you also do this thing where you don't get to start off driving the coolest, most impressive supercar that you could possibly want. You have to sort of earn those stripes by driving sort of a junker and working your way up the ladder, buying those upgrades for your car, sort of putting in the time and effort to eventually be rewarded with, your Lamborghinis, your Ferraris, whatever it is.
Well, let me put it this way. You gain experience points, i.e. credits, in order to upgrade, and you invest in abilities, i.e. cars, that are going to make you, play better, i.e., faster racing. It's an RPG, and I know that this is not an argument that probably gets made a lot, but, if you're going to talk Xenogears and Gran Turismo, it seems like an odd matchup, but yeah, they do have RPG-like progressions.
Yeah, but give me that meaty. Where's that meaty story? I need that meaty story.
Let me talk about that, Kelly.
It's the story of a young, plucky Cuban boy who all he wanted to do was race.
Well, Kelly, let me talk about that because that's something that, to be perfectly frank, I've always desired in a racing game. I've always wanted, a real story that I can connect with, and it's something that, as the years have worn on and Gran Turismo has released successive iterations, I've been left wanting because over the years it has felt more and more sterile and cold. Like there isn't really an emotional connection to it, other than your connection to your car. So yeah, I mean, in that sense, it's not meant to be that, but I do wish, that it had been like that, but it would have been too much to ask.
Yeah.
I think what it did as excellent as it could have done it.
Let me ask you, Kelly, because I don't think we've touched on this with you. Have you played Gran Turismo? What's your I know it's not in your wheelhouse.
It's outside
maybe.
my scope. No, yeah. Honestly, for the longest time, I mean, I heard of the game when it came out. Gran Turismo, had no idea what it was. For me, for the longest time, what that game signified to me is a cheap game I could buy off the shelf that had 2 discs in it, and I could replace my RPG games. For me, cars, I mean, it's kind of funny that you mentioned the Lancer, because it's the car I have. So I now have a connection with Gran Turismo that way, but I'm just not into cars. So my husband always laughs because when I do play a racing game, I do play Forza from now and then, and I know most people that like Gran Turismo really hate Forza, but I'll make the cars pink and I'll just make them as ugly as possible, and my husband will walk in the room and go, "Oh my god, what are you doing?" So but I can't deny that this game has a huge legacy, of course. Just the fact that it was that simulation racing game, we wouldn't have that Forza without that. You wouldn't have all these incredibly detailed racing games. They'd probably all still be your derby car races and your kart racers. So the game definitely has a huge legacy, and I cannot deny that one.
Yeah, and let me just mention that, that's fine. I mean, Gran Turismo is the type of game that's gonna appeal to a certain type of demographic. Now, that demographic is much greater than the demographic to which Xenogears appeals to, of course, because the demographic of Gran Turismo is anyone that likes cars. The demographic of Xenogears is anyone that's really into anime, philosophical, religious allegory, deep RPGs, which is much smaller. Not saying that one is better than the other, except that, it just gives you a broader sect, that would probably play this game. And it's totally fine to not be into cars. And I think that, if you're not into cars, it's kind of hard to get into Gran Turismo. And in that sense, it's probably almost a more male-oriented game, because, guys just pretty much grow up, being into cars and being told that cars are this cool thing. So there also might be that element there.
And I will say, as I'm looking at these two games, I really am trying to make this decision in my mind, as you're both talking about them. But it seems like, Xenogears, obviously, big JRPG, sort of going against the grain a little bit in terms of maybe the types of stories that it was trying to tell and, the sort of characters that it was creating in this world. Gran Turismo definitely going against the grain of what was, like Ozzy was saying, if not completely, arcade racing games were dominating that space. And I think they both sort of put themselves out there trying to move the needle one way or the other. I think that Xenogears didn't stick its landing because of a number of reasons that we talked about. Obviously, Gran Turismo did, but I think that they both show that, when you have somebody who just has, very single-minded determination to do one thing, you get some pretty interesting results. Regardless of what we think, these are clearly two very good games, and games that have their own legacies within their own communities. So I think, what on the face of it sort of looks like an uneven matchup or maybe just a weird pair of games to compare, I think has a lot more there than we initially thought.
All right, let's take a break.
Yep. back, guys. All right, so Kelly, I think that we haven't given you enough of the floor yet. I know we've talked a lot about Xenogears, but I know that you have some more things that you want to say about it. So take it away.
Well, for me, I mean, we've been talking a lot about how, the sales competition and how broad everyone knew about the games. And in that sense, Xenogears just cannot compare to Gran Turismo. But for me, being the niche gamer that I am, the legacy of Xenogears is more about what happens when you try to crunch time your development cycle. That first disc was just pure joy for me. And when we hit that second disc and it just rushed to the end, everyone was for years just trying to figure out what happened. And I actually read recently that they're at E3. It came out that finally it wasn't so much that they ran out of budget, which was what what everyone thought for so many years. What happened was that the 2-year development cycle was over. They had to ship the game. So they had a choice. They could end it at the end of disc 1, or they could see it through to the end how they wanted to, but they would have to do it in a very quick format so they could get it out on time. And they decided that that was what they wanted to do. They wanted to tell the whole story, but the only way they could get it out was to rush through to the end. So many people now are like, okay, well, would we have wanted that unfinished game? Or do we want to take it in the format that it came out in? For me personally, I'm glad it came out as it did, but this is one of the reasons I really, really want to see this one remade someday. But I think it's in a licensing hell, so who knows if we'll ever see actually Xenogears remade someday.
Yeah, I didn't know it was in licensing hell. I thought that Square owned the rights to that. But I guess, with the Xeno franchise, the other Xeno franchises, I guess that there is some controversy there.
Yes.
But Kelly, I mean, I don't only think that it was the fact that, that the second disc didn't stick the landing and that they were just trying to rush, to provide their, conclusion to the story the way that they envisioned it. I think it's also that I don't think it's an RPG that has aged particularly well. And even for the time, I think it had some massive flaws that cannot be overlooked. I think, and let me tell you, I mean, I actually personally love Xenogears. I'm gonna put that out there. It was the first RPG I played, literally. It was the first RPG I had when I came from Cuba because we didn't get RPGs in Cuba. So I have a personal attachment to Xenogears. Let that not be taken into account. But I think that. First of all, from a gameplay perspective, it really suffers from the typical RPG issues. There are too many random battles that, if you go back nowadays and play the game, it will beat you over the head with how many random battles there are. It's like you can only go a few steps before getting into a random battle. And also, it has that problem where you kind of hit a wall, an artificial wall, because you don't have enough leveling in order to progress. And for a long time, I was stuck in the cave section because I couldn't beat this boss called Calamity, I think, if I recall correctly. And I just didn't know, because at the time I really wasn't well versed into the RPG conventions, that I just did not have, the proper level. And to me, that's just kind of so anathema to proper game development. I get it when, in RPG, you beat more monsters in order to feel like you can succeed if you're not a good player. That's the concept behind Dragon Quest. Yuji Horii, what he thought was, look, even if you're not good, if you keep trying, you're gonna make it. But even if you're doing well and you're doing everything you can, but it's just the odds are so against you because you're not hitting this numerical level, that you're always bound to lose. That to me is just bad game design. And I think that a lot of RPGs of this era, and even RPGs today, to be honest, they still have that issue. Let me say the other absolutely massive flaw that Xenogears had is that it included platforming in an isometric perspective.
I can agree with you on that one, yes.
Which is a terrible, terrible idea, particularly because it has muddy polygons and it has multiple layers of levels. And it's so disorienting. And whenever you have to do a platforming section in Xenogears, first of all, you need to figure out where the hell to go, because since it's isometric, you don't really have a full perspective of where you're going, even if it has a compass. And in order to stick the landing, in order to get the platforming right, it takes so many tries, and it's such a chore. It's absolutely brutal. And if you go back to it today, you're gonna realize how much you hated this. But that's the thing. I
have been replaying it. I have it on my Vita, and I've been replaying it slowly because so many other games just take up my time. But I honestly, the random battles I haven't even noticed. Maybe it's just so ingrained because that was my era. Breath of Fire is one of the games that I really remember throwing a controller at the wall because of the number of random battles.
Yeah.
And Tales of Destiny.
Breath of Fire is kind of at one extreme.
Tales of Destiny is the same way, same thing. I just wanted to throw, but with Xenogears, I just didn't notice it that much, I guess. I did notice the platforming. That is the one thing that is keeping me from progressing a lot faster in that game, is just the 3D, the fact that you can move the map around. It's just disorienting after a while, and it's just like, wait, where was I? Where am I going? So at that point, I agree with that, but not the random battles I'm just used to. So
I guess it all depends on how used to it you are. I mean, I think that RPGs who've just become accustomed to just grinding, it's just the grind. That's what you play RPGs for, in a way. Me, that's an aspect of RPGs that I've never fully felt comfortable with. And I love RPGs, but it's something that I've always seen as just kind of filler, and a way of padding the game when it doesn't really need it. So your thoughts on grinding, will, shape how you feel about that.
Yeah.
If you come from, the old school age of 16-bit RPGs, and if you play Breath of Fire, then, this is not so bad. Right. It's just, I guess, more of a testament on grinding itself. But I think, at the time when it came out, I was just... anything that had anime cutscenes, I would lap up like, a very overeager puppy. And the fact that this game actually had animated sequences for me was a big part of the draw. And the fact that it had really cool robots, that's something that I will always be down for. So I think that's a big part of the reason why I was so attached to the game, even though it kind of hated me, and I really couldn't, on a gameplay perspective, get into it.
Yeah, I'm the type of gamer who I can forgive a lot for a great story, and for me, Xenogears just has that amazing story, so I can overlook all the gameplay flaws just to replay that story.
Exactly, but it is a flawed game, and you can call it a flawed masterpiece of some sort. It's definitely in the Squaresoft canon. It's one of the more original entries. It's one that kind of stands on its own in terms of doing its own thing. And the relationship, with Sina Nosuke, the relationship with some of the characters, between Faye and some of the characters, it's always interesting. And let me say, the fact that Faye is not a silent protagonist is a pretty big thing. I really like the fact that he's not a silent protagonist.
Yeah.
At the time, every other character, in an RPG was a silent protagonist, and I find that to be such a cop-out. I'm not a fan of that. And Faye, even with his amnesia, is still very much, in the mold of like, your loner type of hero, but still with enough individuality, and particularly, the break in his psyche between the id, the ego, the super ego, and all the various facets of his personality, it brings a very, layered, approach to his character development. So I think that that's something that the game does very well.
Listen, I would agree with essentially everything you said. In terms of the random battles, I'm also a person who doesn't mind random battles, but I've heard, Xenogears is a grind heavy game. So that's definitely something that mechanically could very well turn people off. I want to ask you this, Ozzy, and this might be sort of a weird question, but how did it compare, or not compare, but how do you feel about in Gran Turismo the fact that you have to grind those credits, that you have to sort of do those races multiple times with multiple cars to upgrade in that sense? Did that ever get tiring? Like, what was that experience like?
And to be perfectly honest, if you just want instant gratification, it's not the game for you. I mean, it's a game that required you to work for it. I guess the short way of putting it is that even though you're grinding, it doesn't really feel like it, because the various races just kind of take on an identity of its own, and you're trying to get better at knowing the tracks themselves. And for the most part, you don't have to replay the same races. You just play the various cups, and the cups are different, so they give you different requirements. So this one might be like the all-wheel drive cup. This one might be the only muscle car cup. So it always felt a little bit different. I do have one thing that I was never fond of in Gran Turismo, and a lot of people complain about it, and that's the license. That in order to be able to actually race in the cups, you needed to pass this license. And it was a chore. You actually had to get everything right in order to earn, quote unquote, your license. And I was bothered by it, of course, but you have to think about the fact that because they were doing something so different from what came before it, they really had to teach the player the rules of the game. It was like, you don't know how to drive up to this point, so we're gonna have to teach you how to drive. So for example, if you want to brake, you can't just brake like an outrun where you just brake whenever you want and it just does it. You have to brake at 800 meters in order to get to that point. And depending upon the car that you have, you might need to brake earlier or later. So it really was teaching you the rules of this new genre, and a lot of it are things that we still see today, and it's thanks to those licensing, I think, that we got to learn those rules of the game.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to word this properly, but it seems like both of these games are, in their own way, to the specific people that grew up with them, are big influences. It sounds like, Kelly, Xenogears was a game that really struck you when you played it, and Ozzy, the same I think could be said of Gran Turismo for you. It was something that when you experienced it, it was a big deal, and it was something that sort of stuck with you both.
Yeah, but both of them, both of them actually. Yeah, because let me tell you about Xenogears. I've said it before on the podcast. I think that Xenogears has Yasunori Mitsuda's best soundtrack ever. Yes.
Which he apparently had to be hospitalized after he completed.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But apparently, he says that that's a thing that happened to him a lot when he worked on these games, because he always overworked himself. But this one he described as being pretty bad.
God bless that man. God bless that man. Because let me say, we're comparing this even with Chrono Cross, even with Chrono Trigger. Those are fantastic soundtracks. But if I had to put it, it would be, Chrono Trigger 3, Chrono Cross 2nd, and Xenogears top. It's the difference with Chrono Cross. Chrono Cross has a lot of variation, and I think it's an excellent superlative work. But Xenogears just had that right touch of soaring and then just darkness. It has so many tracks that felt dark and oppressive. And it was the perfect combination of what the game was going for, which is that mix of the mechanical and the biological. There was clanging, there were industrial sounds, but also there were a lot of wind instruments, and there were a lot of kind of earthy tones to it. I honestly, Kelly mentioned yesterday that she listened to Flight, and it was she remembers how much she loves it, and it's true. Like it's a soundtrack that has aged exceedingly well, and I'm glad that Squaresoft is revisiting it recently, because I think it's just, there's no weak point in that soundtrack. From tracks like My Village is Number One, which is the one that you hear on the first town, which is very playful and very wistful in a way. You feel, I have my hair standing on end, because I remember, every time I listen to that track, I feel nostalgia. It just hits me of like being 10 and playing this game. It's so much that it's tied to its soundtrack that it's impossible to separate my feelings from it from the soundtrack. And I don't know, Kelly, if you feel the same way.
Oh, absolutely. For the longest time, A Small of Two Pieces was on a CD that was just constantly playing in my car. I love that song at Flight. The first time I heard it, I just remember putting down the controller and just listening to the song on repeat for a few times through, just because of how beautiful that song was. The soundtrack is amazing.
Yeah, and so a lot of the emotional beats, between the characters, are tied to the music. Even the music box that plays, which is a recurring motif, in the game. It's kind of what's the name of the female character, Kelly? Ellie. So it's kind of like Ellie's theme, and it really drives home the kind of enduring presence of these characters, these two archetypes that are supposed to exist for generations, and they're just reincarnated over time. That really shows through in the soundtrack. And then when you move over to Gran Turismo, it really created a different type of soundtrack. Before Gran Turismo, you didn't really have the type of jazzy lounge music, in racing games. Gran Turismo feels like you're sitting in Tuscany in wine region, and you're just about to sip on this very finely aged Chianti. That's the feeling of playing Gran Turismo. You feel like you're taking part in an elite club. And you could see that anyway, but it feels elegant. It's a game that in its mood, in its feel, everything about it feels elegant. And to this day, there are people that don't play Forza or don't like Forza simply because it doesn't have that feel of Gran Turismo. It doesn't have that coolness of Gran Turismo. It's almost like a Miles Davis song. It's like, okay, this is jazz, but it's not Miles Davis. So in its soundtrack as well, look, I'm not putting this soundtrack on my car to play it on repeat. That's something that I would do with Xenogears, but it's perfectly integrated into the whole. It's a perfect raison d'être of the game itself. And so I think that it really achieved that where no other racing game had tried to implement sound and soundtracks in the way that Gran Turismo did.
Gotcha. Let me ask you this, because I don't know if we've touched on this before. I know Kelly has said, she's gone back to Xenogears. After playing it, she's gone back to it. She still enjoys that experience. Have you gone back to Gran Turismo, the original Gran Turismo, at all? Since you played it, like recently, or has that been something that you've sort of moved past and now you experience it through its newer iterations?
Yeah, it's not. I haven't gone back to it that much. Okay. I think I popped it in like maybe 10 years ago. It's kind of the same issue that you have with sports games, is that if you play it, it's because you want to play a time capsule.
Yeah.
You want to play with cars from that era. You want to see how things compared at that era. But even within the same PlayStation 1 era, most people would go back to play Gran Turismo 2 rather than Gran Turismo 1.
Yeah.
Because it has more cars, it has rally, it has more variety, etc. And personally for me, I would just rather play one of the newer iterations because it kind of does the same thing.
Yeah.
In a more modern way. So I guess in that sense, Xenogears has the leg up. Xenogears is still a very, unique work in that sense. You're not gonna get the same feel of Xenogears by playing Xenoblade.
Yeah,
not at all.
You might see, you might see, shades of it, but it's still not Xenogears.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, so no, I don't think that, I have it. I have Gran Turismo. It's there. It's like a mainstay of every, PS1 collector. I'm pretty sure that a lot of people that bought it originally still hold their copy because they feel very nostalgic about it. It's a game that will never be re-released again, as we saw in the PS1 Classic, just because of how much of a licensing nightmare it would be to release. It would, the cost would, vastly outweigh the benefits of including it.
Yet another connection between Gran Turismo and
but I think that it's still a very important game, and I might not go back to play it as much. The graphics haven't aged all that well, and the physics model is not as refined as it ended up being in the later iterations, but I think it's still very important. But no, Xenogears is a unique work. I don't think that you can really unless, like Kelly says, they make the game again, they remake it, I don't think that you're going to get an experience like that anywhere else. I know that the Xenogears staff worked in a 3DS or DS game. I forgot the name of it. But I have a hard time thinking that would get close to
I think
the Xenogears feel.
Yeah, I think the game you're talking about is Sands of Destruction on
the
DS.
That's exactly the one. Yeah, that's exactly the one.
And the reason I ask is, obviously we're trying to think of these games in this context. So I don't want to take anything away from Gran Turismo by asking you that question. But it's something that in my mind I wonder when we're sort of trying to decide between these two. Is that something that matters? The fact that, like you said, Xenogears is sort of in its own space, and because it never got a follow-up or it never got direct sequels like that, it sort of stands alone as like this one particular thing, whereas Gran Turismo, obviously, because it was so successful, went on to evolve and do all those things.
But Arnie, let me just put it this way: it's kind of the same argument that you would make if you just argued about, which one gets the leg up in terms of sales. Yeah, you could look at that, but it's only one facet of it. Because let me tell you, I can only play Fighting Force on the PS1, and I'm gonna not get something like Fighting Force in any successive, consoles. But does Fighting Force merit the nod over Gran Turismo? Not necessarily. And that's just the first game that came off the top of my head.
Yeah, I agree. It's only one piece of the whole puzzle.
I'm just trying to make the point that it, within the context of 98, it shouldn't be the end-all be-all, just like sales and critical reception shouldn't be the end-all be-all.
I'm not saying it's the end-all be-all. I'm saying, is this something that I should consider? I'm legitimately conflicted about this. Like, I'm trying to think, what are the things that I need to weigh in and against each other? Obviously, there's a list of things that we've already talked about that are being considered, but this is one that I sort of found interesting in that, the fact that Xeno wasn't in that position to sort of follow its story through, whereas Gran Turismo was able to sort of iterate and improve, and Kazunori Yamauchi had that opportunity to take his baby and make it better. Where does that fall in my spectrum?
Let's put it this way, Arnie. If Gran Turismo had not gotten the opportunity to iterate, and there had not been any other simulation games after this, similar to what's happened with Xenogears, people would still be going back to play this game.
Okay.
It would have been almost like the NHL 94 effect.
That's, I think, the crux of what I was asking is, if there had been no other Gran Turismos, do you think you'd still come back to this one and play it?
Absolutely.
Okay.
It would have been in my steady rotation. Like I said, it would have been like the NHL 94 effect. Yes, it's outdated in terms of, its roster, but it's doing something that would have not been done otherwise.
Yeah.
And so, people would have played it anyways. I think if you look at it from that metric, absolutely, it would be almost in the same, echelon as Xenogears.
Okay.
At the same time, because it has been remade and everything else, you have those modern iterations, where with Xenogears, people are still going back. They're playing that original. There's still merchandise being brought out for this game. I don't think you're going to find any, besides the little cars and everything, you're not going to find anyone buying the Gran Turismo original merchandise. There's not online forums that are still discussing what's going to happen. That Perfect Works book, just discussing the legacy of that game is just that huge backstory. It's still in the other games. They're still saying there's still some connecting storylines there, and it's still being discussed to this day how they interconnect and everything else. So that is your legacy right there.
Yeah.
So, Kelly, what you're telling me is that we should have added more robots to Gran Turismo.
Yes. More robots and more religious controversy and all of that.
I think I can objectively say that adding more robots to almost anything will make it better.
I would not argue if there was a Transformers in Gran Turismo. And if that was like, the unlockable at the end.
The final boss.
That would have been pretty cool. That would have been pretty cool.
But, in talking about both of these, I think Kelly brings up a good point. There are obviously fandoms around both of these works that have sort of sprung up, and there are dedicated communities to both of these things, obviously in very different ways. But it's crazy because I keep coming back to, I really thought this was going to be a much easier decision than it's ending up to be in my mind. I really thought on the face of it, this was going to be sort of a we'll talk about it for a little bit, and I think we'll all ultimately come to the same conclusion. But it's so divided now, and I'm still wondering. I am really trying to figure out where I'm leaning at this point. I think it all depends on how much stock you put into any of our particular criteria. Absolutely.
And I think if you put stock in how there's still kind of this mythification of the game, and people still go back to it, then Xenogears absolutely gets the nod. Personal attachment, it's kind of a toss-up, because people do have a personal attachment to it. But in everything else, I think that the Gran Turismo really blows it out of the water. I mean, in critical reception, in sales, in genre defining, in legacy, I think all of that, Gran Turismo just leaves it, no pun intended, in the dust.
Especially if you're already into cars. If you're not.
Yeah. I mean, again, the fact that there are people nowadays that are racing professionally for a living just because of this game, there might not be forums, for it, but it had its effect in much more practical and enduring ways. That's something that we shouldn't, it's just different demographics again. Xenogears is made for a niche audience, it's made for a cult audience. Gran Turismo, it was much broader than that, and it had a long-lasting effect in a much more wide-ranging way than just a forum talking about perfect works and when the next marketing like merchandise or something like that, when the vinyl that I bought up on the first day is gonna be released. I think it just goes beyond that. I think it had a much more deeper and lasting effect. It really was, for a lot of people, the entryway into the world of cars. And that's something that you can't really understate the importance of that. And it's almost like it's a victim of its own success. It was so successful that we now take it for granted. And it did its job so well in ingraining itself into the mentality of gamers, and people that are now not even gamers, but they trace their love to this, that we tend to underestimate it. Whereas with Xenogears, it's very easy to get swayed by the allure of the cult status of the game and the fact that it's so unique and of its time.
But at the same time, we've got Xenogears, and what about the history for the censorship? After this game, you started seeing a lot more of the controversial things coming out, because on this game there were two translators that quit because they just could not handle the fact that they were playing with a game where at the end you were supposed to kill God, and this was a huge thing, and they managed to leave most of that in. They had to change the name to Deus so that people wouldn't get too scared off on it. But if it wasn't for Xenogears bringing that out, would it have taken longer for all of these things to come out? Would it have taken longer for us to get the games that are more controversial, less black and white?
I don't agree with that, Kelly, just because I think that this was just kind of, let me just say, kind of like in the water, at the time. Like, everyone, again, because of the Evangelion effect, everyone was kind of putting some type of killing God, theme into its games, and eventually, we like to joke about it on the podcast. It's kind of like it became a trope in JRPGs, that at the end you kill God. So I don't think necessarily that Xenogears had much of an impact on that and making it more, okay to do these things, because again, to me, the game was almost a blip, upon release, and it's only later that it gained much more of its cult status. So it's easy, in hindsight now, to attribute much more importance as to what its effect could have been than it may really have been. And I think that, games, because of all this kind of edgy, mature, quote unquote, way that developers wanted to approach their stories, particularly like Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VII, you had Genova, and you had, Sephiroth, almost becoming a god at the end. All of that, I think, was just part of what Japanese game developers were doing at the time. And again, I think a big part of that was Evangelion. So can you separate Xenogears from, its derivativeness of Evangelion
Well,
itself?
at the same time, you've got a passive media where you're just watching versus a active one where you are physically picking up that controller and killing God.
Yeah, but it's arguable whether that really made a difference. What I'm trying to say is that its DNA did not necessarily spread. The way that I think you're saying. I think that it's something that was kind of like a parallel evolution. Like other developers were looking to do the same thing. They were looking to push these boundaries. Xenogears was like on its own in terms of its kind of Kabbalah, Bible references and all these things, that was just so convoluted. But I think other games, let me just put it this way, approach that in a more deft and tactful manner than Xenogears is kind of throw everything at the wall and see what sticks approach. And I think, again, Xenogears was a victim of its own ambition. And, it's easy to mistake, just over ambition for narrative complexity, and I feel like Xenogears sometimes goes too far into, I'm just going to throw a bunch of things, and if you look into them, maybe you'll find some meaning to it. And I think that, that doesn't necessarily show narrative complexity. It's just, kind of a crutch in terms of trying to build in depth. Something which, again, I mean, you can also say the same about parts of Evangelion as well. It's something that Japanese developers were doing. They would just name something in a biblical setting just because it sounded cool.
Does Xenogears get any credit in your mind? Because I see what you're saying. Like, this was sort of a thing that was happening, and if Xenogears hadn't done it, somebody else would have eventually done it. I don't think that's too controversial to say. My question would be, do you think they get any credit for being one of those earlier pioneers, or do they get any credit for being one of the first out the gate to do something like that?
I would say yeah. Okay. I would say yeah. I think that Xenogears, particularly in the video game medium, it was the first one to really do that. It was such a hardcore fervor.
Yeah.
And even I remember back then, I mean, people would say, oh, it has a very deep story with religious, and psychological allusions. So it was just kind of like, oh, this is a mature game. And I remember that. And for me, as a very impressionable 10-year-old, that all looked very cool. That all sounded very cool. And I would tell my friends, like, no, this is a real game. Like, this is the game you have to play. Fuck that Final Fantasy shit. This is real.
Yeah.
So yeah, even in its time, people were like, oh yeah, this is a real game. And now in hindsight, I kind of look at it and it's like, a lot of its ideas are very interesting, but it does have that kind of over eagerness to sound deep and sound mature.
Yeah.
And I know, Kelly, we might disagree on that, but I think it's just something, where I think the genre, the medium was growing, and it just kind of had to go through that kind of growing pain of, trying to, it's like a 19-year-old writing, a philosophical dissertation, and just kind of really thinking that what it's saying, it's, the revelation of God. And, at the end of the day, it's just a 19-year-old just putting shit on the paper. So I'm not trying to sound critical of Xenogears. I'm just saying that a lot of its complexity can be overstated. A lot of it is just mumbo jumbo. And I think that, this too kind of really reflects that.
For me, it's more...
I just lost Kelly. Kelly.
No, for me, it was more just seeing something controversial. It didn't have to be religion or anything else. I mean, just the controversy itself was the fun part for me. I actually was in a state where I was in college at the time, so I was just studying religion itself. So this game helped me bring in different religions and just go out there and see what was out there and discover for myself who I was. So
yeah, and I guess in that way, I mean, like, it serves as a kind of an introductory piece to religions and ideas. Like, Zoroastrianism. That's not something that I had heard before. Before I ran into Xenogears, and so it made me look into what was the name of that encyclopedia that we used to get in like this and stuff. So that Encarta.
Yes.
So Encarta Encyclopedia, and I was just like, Zoroastrianism. That's really cool, man. Games are cool, aren't they?
Well, see, here's the thing: is I do think I tend to agree with you, Ozzy, where the sort of deepness or complexity of Xenogears' story may or may not be earned at the end of the day. But I think when we're thinking 1998, I think generally, obviously, we're trending towards video games are not seen as just a children's medium at this point at all. In fact, I think that generally PlayStation's audience was trending upwards in that sort of teenager to young adult range. But to see something like this in a medium like video games is important in its own way. I think if all it did was sort of open the door for more things like this to be made available, to be translated and brought over outside of Japan, I think that's worth some points in my book.
Yeah, but I think fortunately it didn't, and I would have been way on board on that. But it's just like some of the things that it did just did not translate.
Yeah.
Just did not really. I mean, the idea of killing God and the idea of fighting God and all these things, I mean, it eventually, like I said, it became an RPG trope. But, I think that a lot of people realize that, this story and its whole convoluted, messy plot lines, was not something worth emulating. That, Takahashi had kind of shoot off more, had bitten off more than he could chew. And I think that's probably the reason why he's still kind of trying to go at it with the Xeno games. I mean, he's trying to, look at it from different perspectives and try to present his vision in a different way, even though, even besides the point that he doesn't have the license to Xenogears. But I don't know. I am very conflicted about this, if you can't tell.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that, I think that it definitely has a standing, in terms of its legacy as one of the few games that really dove into this with delight. It really was part of its identity, but whether it succeeded or not, I think it's up for debate. And I think that there are very few, if any, games in the Xenogears mold other than Xenosaga.
Yeah.
Xenosaga is probably the one that gets closest to Xenogears in terms of its themes, but it's still not Xenogears. But I don't think that it really had an impact on other RPGs of the time. We might start seeing them nowadays with other RPGs, and other developers that came of age during this period and were very influenced by this. But as of now, I don't see it necessarily.
Yeah, I don't think you can. I don't think you can trace a line from Xenogears to outside of Xenosaga, obviously, and maybe Xenoblade Chronicles, sort of see those influences as clearly as you can with something like Gran Turismo, where it had a number of imitators, even going back to its earliest days. But I mean, we've talked about Forza. I think Project Gotham Racing was another game that was sort of in that Gran Turismo mold, where they tried to make it more realistic.
No, Arnie. I think that after Gran Turismo, literally every developer tried their hand at a sim, at an auto sim. So Capcom tried it with Automodelista.
Yeah.
Konami tried it with Enthusia Professional Racing. Squaresoft tried it with Driving Emotion Type S. Give me another one and I will tell you what they did. every single developer at the time and publisher, they tried their hand at a simulation, and it was only after the PS2 generation that they realized we can't compete. One, because it takes a massive amount of money in order to license the cars.
Yeah.
And two, because Gran Turismo is such a behemoth of its own. The only one that could really compete was Forza, and that was because they had Microsoft money. So it eventually became win or out. It's only recently that we have seen other, more independent developers actually try their hand at the simulation genre, like with Assetto Corsa, I forgot the name of the other one. Just a number of other games like the grid games, etc. That have tried their hands at the Gran Turismo mode. Even Need for Speed at the time tried their simulation genre. So if imitation is a sincerest form of flattery, Gran Turismo was very flattered because everyone tried their hand at it. And even more importantly, everyone tried their hand at it and realized we're not Gran Turismo, so we shouldn't compete. So that's an even bigger, arrow in his quiver. So yeah, I mean, I guess the reason why we focus more on Xenogears is because, Xenogears is a scrappy underdog. Like, we can't really argue, the merits of Gran Turismo. Like, they're there, they just exist. Whereas with Xenogears, its merits are worth arguing. They're worth discussing, and we want to see it succeed because it was so, it was so different, and it's still very different even to this day. I just think in the context of this battle of 1998, as I like to call it, it's like the two teams in the World Cup that. They go on 0-0, and they go into overtime, and then they lose on penalties. It's just, Gran Turismo gets 3 more, penalty kicks, to Xenogears' 2. If we're gonna go with this kind of seeded, analogy. So that's the way I feel, I think, and again, because Gran Turismo does not have a story, it's a little bit more difficult to build that connection to it, and I think that makes it seem like it's less important, but it shouldn't be, and I love Xenogears. I will play Xenogears from time to time over and over again, and maybe see if finally I can beat it one of these days. But I want to stick to the format of what we have here, and it's just within the format. I think that Gran Turismo gets the nod.
I mean, here's the thing: is I feel like you've basically done what I was going to lead into, which is final arguments and then your vote, which is great. I loved it. So I think you're very clearly sticking with Gran Turismo. I don't think there's anything me or Kelly could do or say to sort of shift you out of that position. So Kelly, why don't you give me your sort of final thoughts on everything and tell me which of the two you'd like to see go on?
Well, I would be, of course, the exact opposite. Just because if I were to pick one of these two games to continue playing today, it would definitely be Xenogears. If I was to try a Gran Turismo, it would be a more recent one. For legacy, of course, it would be Gran Turismo all the way, just because of how influential it's been on that genre. Xenogears, it may exist in its own little vacuum, but its legacy really is in how flawed it is. And like I said, this would be, if I could pick one game to be remade, Xenogears would be it. The battle system, while still great, it's its own unique little fighting game, make the combo system work. I would love to see that again in a modern formation, but I can still go back and play it nowadays. Even the gear battles, just making sure you have enough gas and enough energy to keep going, that it's still such an interesting mechanic to this day. The soundtrack, there's just no competition. It's one of my favorite video game soundtracks of all times. I still pop it in, listen to it. Every time I hear Flight, I just stop and put it on repeat a few times. The game is one I would still play to this day. There's not too many PS1 games that I can say I will still play this today. I'll either look for the remake or something else, but Xenogears, I've got it on my Vita. I will open it up. I will play through it right now in 2019.
Okay. So Xenogears it is then.
Yes.
All right.
Kelly, that's a very convincing
Here's were you going to say something?
Tell me, Arnie.
Oh. So, okay. I swear to God, I'm not trying to make this dramatic at all. When I sort of saw this matchup, I really was convinced I'm going to be Camp Xenogears, because I'm a big RPG guy, and this is sort of the era where an RPG like this would have grabbed me the most, probably. When I sort of break it down, like I said before, it really is, I think, a tale of two games, right? Both very ambitious, both sort of spearheaded by these people who had, had visions of what they wanted to create and were given that opportunity. Obviously, in terms of, how they came to end up, very different paths taken. But I want to say that I agree with Ozzy. I'm trying to stick to the framework of 1998. I don't want to sort of think about the fact that, yes, Gran Turismo in and of itself right now is probably dated when compared to its successors, but I feel like most games would be. So I don't think that's necessarily a fair point of comparison. I do think when it came out, it was revolutionary. It created its own genre, and it, evolved from there. And it's been doing what it's been doing for so long that I think Ozzy is right to a certain extent, where I think people take the original game for granted. That said, Xenogears, obviously no slouch in its own right, especially when you think about the fact that, unlike Gran Turismo, which was sort of creating its own genre, Xenogears planted itself firmly in an established genre and went up against, sort of the titans of that era. Whether it came out on top or not, that's up to personal preference. But I do think that it clearly left its mark. It's still remembered, and remembered fondly by a lot of people, which for a game that, is as flawed as Xenogears is, you wouldn't think would necessarily be the case. Ultimately, I think that I'm going to go Gran Turismo, because I think the legacy is there, and in the context of games from 1998, I think Gran Turismo does enough to sort of stand above Xenogears. So ultimately, I am going to go Gran Turismo.
Oh.
And just for reference, Paul would have gone Gran Turismo as well.
Yes.
So just
standing
to add
on
that,
my own
not
here.
that it matters.
I will
yeah,
say...
we're not. Let me say, Kelly, after your final argument, I for a moment I had doubts. For a moment when you were talking, I was like, "Am I doing the right thing? Maybe I'm not looking at this the right way."
Well, here's the thing,
and that's because I hold such a deep emotional connection to Xenogears.
Yeah. And I will say, Kelly, you are not standing on your own, because I actually ran a couple of polls on our Instagram feed, I think 2 days ago, and let me tell you, I really expected Xenogears and Gran Turismo to be very close. I was like, I could see this one being tight. It was not. Xenogears demolished Gran Turismo. Obviously, the sample size is small, and the circles that we run in, it's probably expected that
it's
the old
a
school
demographic
RPG
that
would
we're
get
in.
the edge. But I was a little bit surprised. I thought that Gran Turismo would get a little more love.
If we're looking at this in a purely personal, approach, Xenogears would have gotten my nod. Like, no freaking doubt. Like, I would not even have, blinked twice. And particularly in the Instagram, community, like the people that we run with, Gran Turismo had no shots, and that's exactly why we want to keep it to a more, formatted, perspective, because otherwise it would have just been, whatever our demographic likes.
Yeah.
And in that sense, it wouldn't be as fun. Or, I think that we need to have this criteria, this, what was this reception? What's the legacy? What's the genre defining? All of that. Because we want to treat it almost like a penalty match. Like, which one of these gets the nod based on all this, metrics. And, that gives the possibility of an upset. And let me tell you, this was a very, very close match.
This was close for me. I did not know which way I was going to go until maybe like the last 10 minutes of this discussion.
Well, Arnie, now you know.
I know. It makes me sad because Xenogears was one of those that I think had it drawn a couple other... Like, there's a couple of games on here that I think had they drawn Xenogears would have come out on top. Unfortunately, it ran into Gran Turismo, which I think, is just a Goliath.
Listen, kind of like that team that goes against the Goliath in the World Cup and does a very good showing. it has our hearts.
Yes.
It took our hearts and it massaged it and it made us feel good.
Yeah.
And now we're gonna be rooting for it, in its absence. So I can't say enough about that. And let me just mention, we struggle with putting Xenogears on here.
Oh yeah,
it was either Xenogears or Parasite Eve.
Yeah.
And Xenogears got the nod. And to be perfectly honest, I was the one that was fighting for Xenogears to be here.
Mm-hmm.
So, take that all into account, when everything I have just said, I really was pushing for this little game that could. So, again, it has our hearts.
Definitely has mine, yes.
So with that, let's give it a fun farewell.
I know. I'm sure Paul will insert like a guillotine noise or a gunshot noise for Xenogears being eliminated as we take it to the back of the
don't kill
barn.
it.
Yeah.
How about a runner-up match?
Faye, poor Faye.
But that does
He's already suffered enough.
Our first episode. Kelly, thank you so much for joining us. I don't want to spoil anything, but I know that you'll make a triumphant return to this tournament before it's all said and done. But thank you so much for giving us your time and your takes on Xenogears.
It is always a pleasure, guys. I'm just on Instagram at @SierraKnightGaming_ or at @SierraKnight_gaming.
That's right. And you can find us on Instagram at Region Free Gamers Podcast, on Twitter at Region Free Gamer. I think you have a Twitter as well, right, Kelly?
Oh, it's a small one. Same thing, SierraKnight_gaming.
That's right. And with that, I think, that concludes that. Please, guys.
Let's wave adieu to Xenogears, guys. Let's give it a
fond
farewell.
A 21-gun salute.
Next round, it won't be so easy.
I know. Oh.
Next round, you'll be facing a buzzsaw as well.
Yep.
So come with your guns ready.
But thank you guys so much. We hope you've enjoyed it. If you did enjoy it, please like, comment, subscribe, rate, review, all those good things. We want to know what you guys think. Let us, feel free once this episode comes out to yell at us and tell us why we suck or why we're great and you agree with everything we said. At the end of the day, I'm very happy. This is going to be fun. I really enjoyed this little experiment, and I think the what's to come is going to be even more insane.